Boom! Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the Hot Path Show, a live show, a weekly live show where we discuss solving problems in game development using data-oriented design. I'm very excited to be here today, joined by my friend Danny. Welcome in, Danny. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Awesome, awesome. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I see a lot of familiar names in the chat, so that is very exciting to see. So, yeah, we're very happy to be here. So anyways, I guess we can just get started just by explaining a little bit about, kind of what this show is and what it's going to be all about. So once again, it is a weekly live show that's going to air here on the Turbo Makes Games YouTube channel every Friday. And so, yeah, basically the idea is that we want to talk more about data-oriented design because there are so many cool and interesting topics in there. So we have a bunch of, fun different segments planned for these shows. And then we're also, each week, we're going to be going into kind of like a main kind of big topic for the week where we're actually going to be showcasing some code and just some different ways to implement things in data-oriented design. I'd kind of wanted to do some, live show like this for a little bit of a while now. And Danny actually recently reached out to me and he wanted to do kind of like maybe like a monthly thing where we're just like, showcase different ways to implement things in data-oriented design. I'm like, you know what? I think this would be like a good opportunity for us to, actually do this weekly show and just really, again, get the community involved. I think this is going to lead to more fun community events where we can start doing, friendly competitions and game jams and just doing all sorts of exciting things around data-oriented design. So I'm very excited for it. Danny, what do you think about that?
I am too. I obviously, reached out to you about it, so I'm definitely excited. Yeah.
Sweet, sweet. Well, yeah, we can just get into it real quick here. If you want to just provide a quick introduction on who you are and kind of what you do. We did a previous live stream where it was just you and me, where we kind of went a little bit more into, your background in game development and how you got to kind of where you are. But just for all the new viewers here, feel free to just give a quick introduction on yourself here.
Well, hi, I'm Danny, as it so nicely says down here. As you can see, I work at Unity, though obviously everything I say here on stream is my own words and not Unity's. So are all the scripts and so on. I've done software for as long as I can remember, since I was 8. So yeah, I'm excited to see where this leads us.
Awesome. And you of course can't talk about anything that's like, NDA or upcoming, but are you able to give us like a brief overview about anything that you've worked on in the past or anything that you're able to talk about that you're working on right now?
Sure thing. I mean, very recently I made some changes to Entity's graphics, which we'll see some nice baking improvements. But historically, I've worked a lot on System API, which is like a very common API now. Definitely be showing that later.
Yep.
And also like iJob Entity and other source generator-based features. A lot of them I've helped make. Yeah. And obviously there's actually, funnily enough, also some of my coworkers in chat. So
yeah, it's exciting to see. And then, yeah, I'm Johnny. I run this YouTube channel, the Turbo Makes Games YouTube channel. The past couple years, I've been doing a whole lot of videos on Unity's data-oriented technology stack and have had the opportunity to do contracting work where I am using dots in production. So again, we just wanted to come here and share a bunch of things with data-oriented design with you all here. So anyways, before we get into things, real quickly, I do just want to mention that we have set up a Patreon where you can support this show, where there are going to be a lot of fun and exciting bonuses. So Patrons at all tiers will get access to a monthly bonus video that I've posted. So the first one is up already. It's actually a talk that I gave at the Game Dev Guild conference last year called Modular Data-Oriented Design. It's a super good talk that I'm really proud of. I think it does a good job about showing some of the benefits of data-oriented design that aren't necessarily performance-related. Of course, a lot of things related to data-oriented design that we'll be going over in this show are very much performance-related and everything like that. But this talk shows some of the other cool and interesting ways you can use data-oriented design to have much more modular video game. So yeah, very excited for that. And yeah, feel free to go check out the Patreon. There are a lot of cool and exciting other bonuses on there as well. So anyways, we can go ahead and start getting into some of the different little segments here. Actually, first thing, I'll have Danny just go ahead and give a quick introduction on what our main topic is. That's going to be happening a little bit later in the show. But yeah, if you just want to give a quick little introduction on what we're going to be talking about today.
Sure thing. As the name of the show today kind of suggests, it's actually going to be a lot about instantiation and specifically what it means to instantiate, some of the things that make it differ from what a game object is, and some of the quirks around it as well, and some stuff on transform usage flags and yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to be a lot of digging into some of our caveats with the API, but also trying to go from basics and then explaining what is it actually doing behind the scenes.
Yeah. And I should point out, just kind of in general, talking about this show, most of the stuff that we're going to be talking about, kind of at least towards the beginning, first couple episodes of this show, are mostly going to be focused around Unity's data-oriented technology stack and stuff like that, because again, that's what we are most familiar with. But myself, Danny, and our other co-host Tobias, who is going to be on the next episode, we're all just kind of fans of data-oriented design in general. So we want to start talking about other data-oriented programming languages. In fact, we're going to be talking about one at the end of the show here today, just a little bit. So yeah, definitely look forward to all that. And then also, I just wanted to put out a quick disclaimer again that this show isn't necessarily affiliated with or endorsed by Unity, and just again, all the opinions that we share on this show are all our own. I don't work for Unity, but Danny does, so I just kind of wanted to put that out on the first episode here. So anyways, we will go ahead and get into our first little segment of the show called the Prefetch. So just have a little warm-up topic to just kind of get the wheels rolling before we start moving into some of the more serious topics here. So with this, I actually wanted to share a little bit of a video where I'll go ahead and do this and go ahead and share the tab here. So this is actually a Linus Tech Tips video that came out the other day where they're doing a little bit of testing with a new Threadripper Pro. This is a 96-core CPU, which has 192 threads. And there was something a little bit interesting that happened. So I'm just going to kind of play this video a little bit here.
First?
I want to play City Skylines too.
Of course you do.
All of you guys know that this game is very difficult to run.
Demanding.
So I just wanted to kind of point this out real quick because they're going to be testing this using City Skylines 2, which is a game made with Unity's entity component system. They kind of were mentioning some things about the performance and all that in here. It is kind of maybe conflating a couple different things because it seems like, at least from what I've read, that most of the performance issues have been kind of mostly things on the graphics side, whereas things on the CPU side have been in general pretty good. However, the city that they're testing with here is going to be, I think it's like a 1 million population city. And of course, when you're simulating, 1 million people, the CPU is going to get taxed pretty well.
1 million population city. This was sent to me by Bitha.
Our system would simply.
So I'll just go ahead and play the part where they actually open up the system profiler here.
This game would use the CPU cores you gave it.
So here is all 192 threads. You can see basically the CPU on these. The reason that I wanted to bring this topic up is just because there is a little bit of an interesting observation here. You see that not all the cores are actually being used. So you can see that there's about 64 of these cores that are at 100%. Another group of 64 of these are around 50%. And then there's another 64 that are basically at 0%. So I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit and, bring up with Danny and just kind of talk a little bit about why the CPU, is like that. It's like, why aren't all cores, actually being used and stuff like that. So yeah, do you have any input on that, Danny?
Well, the sad part is I don't actually know why it doesn't fill out, because at least as far as Unity is concerned, we do have a max set of, I think 128 is our max thread core count. That being said, I am actually glad to see so many maxed out because I think, I would be curious to know the previous City Skyline, because I know for on some Reddit post or somewhere, one of the developers actually went and said that was one of the few things that didn't cause us issues. CPU is actually better in this game than the past one, but
right.
GPU is really, really slowing us down here. which is, a little sad. And obviously, we would like to see this number go up.
Yeah, certainly.
So,
Yeah, and no, I think you're right. I think the last one, it wasn't using, dots or any type of entity component system. And I think from what I've heard that was one of the biggest issues with the first game, is that it was very much CPU bound, especially when you got to, bigger and bigger cities. So they kind of fixed the CPU problem, but now they're very much GPU bound. But still, it is interesting to see a game that can actually tax a $10,000 CPU this much. But it would be cool to actually maybe in a future update that kind of removes some of those limitations to actually see all 192 individual threads running on there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I also I expect to see this number grow as they figure out what is happening on the graphics side. Maybe they're going to spend some of those cores doing some, occlusion culling or something like that.
Right.
I know it was definitely partly also due to Entity's graphics initially not being as good as it is today. Like, it didn't have as many features, certainly. Like deformation, I don't think was a thing back then.
Because if I'm not mistaken, the City Skylines does not use Entity's graphics, right? Because I think they had kind of noticed some of those limitations and issues early on, so then they kind of ended up, doing kind of essentially their own implementation?
Yeah, exactly. And this was long ago. Some of those features have made it in, as far as I'm aware. But no, they're going their own path, and you can see that in the DLLs. And some people have already broken it way more down than I have here. Made whole blog posts. I know apparently it wasn't the thief that is causing the issues, but the fact that everything is just weirdly scaled, and there are models that have a bazillion vertices that you barely even see.
Right. Well, maybe they'll nail it in City Skylines 3 then, right?
Hopefully update this one, actually.
Yeah. That would kind of be the ideal situation. But anyways, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. I thought it was funny that in the Linus Tech Tips video, they did kind of like a showcase on something with this many cores, and we actually kind of ran into a limitation of Unity seemingly right here, where we're kind of like hitting a core count limit. So that would be nice to see that limit get removed, but obviously not practical for 99.99% of people.
Not at all. It was also kind of funny seeing you mentioning this video on the proposal, because this video did show up internally as well. Someone did go, "Hey, why is that? Why are we not seeing everything here?"
Yeah. So good to know that it's on you guys' radar. So anyways, we can kind of move over to the next section here, which I call error correction code. So this is where we'll do just corrections from our previous episode. So of course, because it's the first episode, we don't have anything to correct. So we're batting 1,000 today. But of course, if we do make any mistakes or there's any extra context that people might want to add, feel free to leave that in the comments of the the VOD of this here, and then we can bring them up on the next show. So anyways, the next segment that we have is cache hit, which is our Unity Dots quick tip. So this is basically, we just kind of want to bring a little bit of awareness to different things in the Unity API that might not be like as widely known, or there's just like kind of quick little tips that kind of help our own workflow that we can just explain in a quick minute or two here. So I have the quick tip of the week here. So I'll go ahead and I need to go ahead and share a different screen. This is this here. Okay, and so what I wanted to showcase is, I'm sure if you've been using Unity ECS, Danny brought it up a little bit earlier, but we have this system API, and it's super handy because it allows us to do things like this get singleton, and there's get component. And basically the idea is it uses code generation to kind of implement the most optimal way to achieve that goal there. And it's really nice to use because we can often do these like simple one-line things that do a couple things in the background that we don't necessarily need to worry about, and it's just we can trust that it's going to do the best thing for us. Now, sometimes, especially when using managed components, which are like classes that are implement iComponent data, where we're interfacing with managed types and things of that nature, the system API, it kind of ended up falling a little bit short. So for example, like if I wanted to, this is actually from the Netcode for Entities tutorial that I'm working on right now. So in the past, if I wanted to say spawn a health bar UI prefab, what I would end up having to do is get a reference to the prefab entity first, just by doing like a system API.getSingletonEntity, and then using the unmanaged type, this MOBA prefabs, which has like entity references, so that you see that this is a public struct here, to get a reference to that entity. And then I would have to use the entity manager by doing a state.entityManager.getComponentObject UI prefabs, and then actually get the health bar prefab that I wanted. Now, again, it's two-line thing. It's not really like all that much crazy work, but it is sometimes a little bit confusing when you try to do something like a system API.getSingleton, try to get the UI prefabs. You'll see that doesn't work. And then even if you have a reference to this prefab entity and you try to do a get component against the UI prefabs and get the health bar, that doesn't work. And even doing a get singleton entity against the UI prefabs doesn't work. So you'd have to tag, go off of another tag component or something of that nature. So the thing that I wanted to point out here is in the system API, there actually is a managed API, which gives you access to a lot of the same operations in the system API, but they're fully compatible with managed types. So you see that I'm doing a system API .managed API, and here's where I can do a .get singleton, and then the UI prefabs and get the health bar off of that. So this is actually a super handy thing. It's something that I've probably seen in the changelog as I've read this, but I never really it was kind of one of those things that I just kind of immediately forgot about it and never used it. And I think I actually saw maybe some of Danny's code that he was sharing with me one time where he was using that. I'm like, oh, that actually could be really nice to use. So I'm sure many people maybe already are using this, but there might be some people who are not aware of this as well. So it is, again, a lot easier where I can just now do this super simple one-line system API.managed API. Again, gives us access to a lot of those functions. So that is the cache hit Unity Dots quick tip of the week. Danny, you got anything to add on that?
No, I think it's all good. There is, I guess, one, which is that actually one of the main reasons it was added, and I added it specifically, is the fact that all of these API, while available, are not that discoverable. The ironic thing is this one also happens to be one of those that are not that discoverable. But actually, I think later on I might show some of the source generation, because that one is in particular is interesting.
Yeah, sweet. That would be awesome. All right, so that is the cache hit Unity Dots quick tip of the week. Next, we'll go ahead and do a little context switch here. Here's where we're going to go ahead and just go over the Unity Dots changelog. Of course, this isn't going to be a segment happening every week because, basically there's the, changelog only comes out every so often. But anytime that it does come out, I do just want to bring it up on the show. When we don't have this, we'll have some other kind of segments to enter here as well. But I'll go ahead and pull this up here.
And actually, just before that, there's an interesting comment here, which is someone asks, as far as I understand, entities for each don't support managed API. And that is correct. I just wanted to specify that.
Does entities for each support just regular system API?
It indeed does.
Okay.
And
I haven't used
specifically
entities for
has
each in a while.
Yeah, if you notice, all of the methods that are in system API happen to be in system base originally, and so all of those methods were made obsolete in change of system API. And so because those old APIs were working with entities for each, they also had to work with system API, which is the new API.
Gotcha. Okay, so we can go over some of the things in the changelog here. So I just wanted to talk about a couple things in the newest 1.2 pre-release version. I think I've done the 1.1 version on a previous video on my channel. But again, just want to do these in kind of the live streams here now. So we have the one thing actually I do want to point out is this 1.2.0 pre-release 6, which was kind of in the middle of December last year. The only thing that says it was changed is promotion preparation. So, you know, I'm kind of reading into this on my own a little bit, thinking that, you know, this is likely going to be a full released version sometime very soon. But of course, no official word on that yet. And then so going into excuse me, some of the actual changes from the pre-release 4 version, wanted to talk about a couple things here. So there is this defensive fix for rare hierarchy window on cleanup exception, typically when breakpoint debugging. This is something that I had actually experienced where I was basically getting all kinds of errors thrown just like when I was clicking things in the entities hierarchy window. And it was particularly annoying when I had a debugger connected to Unity because it would break on that exception and then like, you know, freeze everything and then like kick me back over to my, you know, IDE where I was doing the debugging. And like, I just couldn't really do anything because it was basically spitting out this exception every single frame. So even if I skipped past it, it would just like throw it again. And then it was kind of annoying because I had to like, you know, like disconnect the debugger and then, you know, could go back and do things. If I needed to debug again, then I'd have to, you know, reconnect the debugger. So it was a little bit annoying there, but I'm glad that that's fixed. I'm not entirely sure if I'm remembering this correctly because I'm going back and forth between a bunch of different projects of different versions. But I thought I had seen this happen a couple times recently. So I can't remember if this was on a 1.2 version or just a 1.0 version. So yeah, hope that's fixed because that was a particularly annoying one for me. And then, so just talking about like some of the entity queries here. So there's an entity query that uses the with none with an enableable component T will now insert a read dependency on T in the system's query so that jobs which enable and disable T are included in the system's input dependencies. So definitely like a good thing to, you know, just kind of add to our dependency queries, you know, when we're kind of like doing any particular things with that. This one I thought was just kind of funny here. Selecting entities and systems now works again. No additional context to that, but yeah, I think that was another one that I had noticed at one point in it does seem to be fixed now in the 1.2 version, but there was a time where like I would click things again in entities hierarchy and then it didn't show up in the inspector. And then I had to like, ended up finding this weird workaround way where I could like select something else and then, or select the entity another way. But it was very, very annoying. So glad that that one is resolved, but you know, how it broke in the first place, not exactly sure on that one. So going into a previous version of 1.2, so here's something that was added, serialization support for Unity Object Ref, which works in the build system. This means an unmanaged iComponent data can reference Unity assets and works in a build loaded from a subscene, and the same as with managed components. Now, I wanted to bring this up because I know that Unity Object Ref is a particularly useful thing, and I know, Danny, you're a little bit fond of that, so do you have anything to say on Unity Object Ref and just kind of maybe give people a quick idea of what it is?
I mean, it's one of my, you know, I so love that feature because it is so lovely being able to have like a bursted situation where you can change around the managed references. Like for instance, a very popular thing where we, you know, have a shit ton of references, but all we're doing is manipulating those references is entities graphics, where you see this thing called a render mesh array, and the render mesh array is just a conglomerate of all the meshes and materials in your scene. So like it will like try to figure out, oh, all these individual objects have these meshes on them and all these materials, and it will like try to merge them into one thing. Obviously, these are all references, and so wouldn't it be lovely being able to, you know, have a thing that is bursted, being able to do this compression, also because it is an action you can very much vectorize in a hash set. And so like having an unmanaged reference to stuff is just so powerful. And also the fact that you can do this, like you can just put an iComponent data on your entity during baking, and it store a reference to a Unity object ref of mesh and Unity object ref of texture, and it just works. It's so nice. It's like yeah.
I'm sure we'll definitely get into Unity object ref at some point on this show because very, very handy. And then the last thing that I was just going to bring up in the regular ECS API is that we now have several entity command buffer commands will now correctly fix up entity references within component values recorded in commands to replace the temporary entities created at record time. So if you know how entity command buffers work, if you say instantiate an entity, before that entity gets played, it gets just kind of like a default, basically like garbage entity ID and index. And then, so if you try to like store a reference to that garbage index and then use it later on, then you start getting kinds of errors and stuff like that. But luckily this seems like it's kind of cleaned up some things where if you are doing some, instantiation and doing things with like the linked entity group and all that, during kind of that time where you're adding commands to the entity command buffer, it should interpret those all correctly if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
Sweet. And then real quick, I just wanted to bring up a couple things on the netcode for entities changes, just because I've been using the netcode for entities stuff a lot lately as I've been working on my netcode for entities tutorial, which hopefully should be out within the next couple of weeks here. But basically there are two really cool things that they added here. So you can now disable the automatic entities iCustom bootstrapping. Basically the automatic iCustom bootstrapping, what it does is if you hit play or create a build and you start your game, it'll automatically create worlds for the client world and server world. Now that ends up being a little bit of a problem because if you want to have maybe some like entrance logic where you kind of like are, trying to like enter a specific server, like connect to a specific server or something like that. Like you don't want the game to just automatically build the client and server worlds for you. You want to like have a little bit of control over that as the developer. So it wasn't too difficult. You could like, previously create like a system where it would like ignore creating those worlds. And then, when you wanted to manually create the worlds, you could do that. So now they've actually added a couple of easy ways to do this. One of them, which I haven't actually found this option in the project settings, but apparently there's a way that you can disable it in the project settings. I haven't actually found that, but there is a override automatic netcode bootstrap mono behavior, which you can add just to a game object in your scene. And then just set the disabled option on there to, disable that automatic bootstrapping so those worlds aren't created by default. The other thing that I wanted to point out, which was super cool, and by the way, I am using both these features in the new netcode for entities tutorial because they are very handy. So there is a new netcode config scriptable object. And so this has basically like everything in that you would want to configure for your netcode in here. So you can like, configure your update rate and all kinds of different things. There's like probably like 20 to 30 different fields of things that you can configure in here. But you can reference this asset super easily from any system or any authoring script or anything like that. So you can, if you need to calculate, some tick count based off of like a timer and the number of ticks, and like the server update rate, you can like easily do that just by referencing this netcode config scriptable object. So something super handy to have. So anyways, that is it for the context switch. Do you have any things that you'd like to point out or add there?
Not really, but I do see another question, which is this one: does Unity object ref have API to check if ref exists? And yes, it does. I recommend checking the documentation, but you can see it's just is valid. So you can do .is valid, and it will check if an object actually maps back to it.
Awesome. Easy.
Yes.
Okay, so moving on to the main portion of the show, instruction set. So we're going to be talking about, we're going to have Danny talk about, one way to do entity instantiation in Unity ECS. So yeah, this will be kind of the main portion of the show where, again, Danny's going to be showcasing some ways to do a little bit of entity instantiation and kind of go over some of the common pitfalls of things associated with that. So yeah, feel free to take it away, share your screen, do what you need to do.
Yes, I will try to expertly share my whole screen. Hopefully I'm not showing anything I shouldn't do. So this is the little cute project, some nice little assets by a guy called K. Lausberg. I hope I'm not butchering his name, also known as K-Kid. There is a little license notice so you can see like where you can find his stuff. It's pretty cool. It's free and all. And yeah, let's quickly see what the scene does. So we have a little nice spinning guy, and I can spawn some things into the scene, and they get destroyed. There's a little bug right now. I'm going to fix that before it, gets pushed out too much. But anyway, this is just a bug with the destruction. So anyways, it also, we can spawn things by pressing space, and we can press A, which stops him. Now, the interesting thing is what happens here. So the main bulk initially is just, okay, how do we instantiate? Like, let's just try to remember how we instantiate a prefab. Well, if we look at this object in here, we have spawn prefab. And it's just an empty game object that has this little script on it. And let's go into detail on what this script does. Well, we get a reference to the prefab.
Can you zoom in on the script a little bit there?
Yes, I guess I zoomed it out actually. There we go. Now it should be very visible.
Yep, it looks good to me.
Yes. And so, yeah, we have a reference to the prefab. And let's quickly also look at what that prefab is that we have a reference to. It is this coin. So it just has a mesh renderer and looks like this. So it's a coin. And then we have an offer to have it constantly move to the right and some lifetime. So it, dies after some time is gone. So that is what we have a reference to. We then, have a baker that tries to bake it in. And we say, hey, this entity here, the one that is doing the spawning, let's actually make it a renderable, because that means that we can move at runtime where the spawn point is located. And we also get a local to world to attach to. Another alternative that we could have done is we could have stored it in the prefab data, and statically that would be determined and stored and dereferenced. But this is nice for a later purpose. But in any case, we then have a get entity that does the getting of the prefab. And something that's quite interesting that happens here is if we notice in our entities hierarchy, and we go, normally we can find that here. There's a few different options. Now I have all these extra options because I have added the ability to show advanced worlds, which you can find under Edit Preferences, Entities, and then you can say Show Advanced Worlds, which allows me to show all these extra worlds. So we can also actually see all the intermediate worlds that baking uses during the baking step. Initially, let's just look at the editor world here, and we go to runtime. One of the things we see for this spawn prefab is that in actuality, it has this is the entity itself, but there's also this blue thing here, which is the coin C, which happens to map to the prefab that we had. And the reason for this is that when we do a get entity on an asset, it will put into our baking format that, hey, at some point you should start baking it. If we actually go into get entity and see what it does, hey, is this an offering object? Hey, is this actually a prefab? If it is a prefab, we should, add it to a baker state so that we should, start turning that into an entity as well, and do all the baking process for that. And something that happens during that process is that we add this little component to it called the prefab component. And so what happens when you have that component? Well, the meaning of that component is quite simple. And that's actually what our little doll is about. So if we look at our doll is, let's quickly go back to the offering, is another simple one here. It is this one. It just has a spin offer on it. And, none of this is a prefab, but, it's a normal entity, just like any other, and it just has a spin script on it. And that spinning script means that it does some spinning, this being the spinning. But what I also have the ability to do in this system here is I have the ability to add or remove the prefab component to that spinning entity. And so we can, when I press A, we see that the entity will have the prefab component. And if I press it again, it will not have it. So it keeps flicking that on and off. And what that allows me to do is show what happens when there is a prefab component to an entity that is already spawned. So something that is not already a prefab suddenly gets to be like a fake prefab. Because again, the concept of a prefab doesn't really exist in entities. And that has to do with how instantiate works. And I'll get to that in a second. But first, let's quickly see down here. There is the prefab component. There's no prefab component. And actually, Johnny, I have a question for you. Can you guess why the legs are the only ones to stop displaying when he stops rotating?
Does it have to do with how the parenting is structured?
It very much does. If you quickly look here, every one of these has a mesh added to them. And it happens that the legs here are, the base. So the one that we have added the prefab component to are the legs, not everything else.
Interesting. So that doesn't render, but everything else still does.
Exactly.
Weird.
Yeah. And so that also leaves you with another assumption, which is what happens normally, do you think, to when you try to render a render mesh, turn that into a prefab?
I mean, I would assume that the rendering system just wouldn't run on that, so it wouldn't get rendered, right?
Yeah, well, what I mean is, if you look here in the editor, we obviously have everything down here, right? Now, I could obviously turn this into a prefab, put it down here and have a baker say get entity on that, and so it gets asked to bake. But that doesn't mean that you would see this entire thing inside the scene suddenly. So let's say I were to, put it down here. I go, hey, where is my thing that does all the spawning? It is here. What happens if I were to spawn one of those spinny thingies? Well, okay, boom. Oh, wrong button. So now I have an extra one. But notice that I didn't just have, the fake one, because there should be a fake one in the scene now as well. And it's a little hard actually to see where that fake one is, because we're in runtime. I'll quickly just do this. Okay, which one would it be? The one that actually has the prefab component would be the one. It's a little hard to differentiate because obviously one of them is a prefab of a model and the other one is a prefab entity. This one displays blue whether or not it is one or the other. Let me quickly see. Okay, it is this one, but it also means that if you go into this one right here, it too should have a prefab component. And so it means that as far as our baking setup goes, it will add the prefab component to all of the hierarchy that is part of that baking process. So that's another little tell that when we go to say bake as part of our, where is it? Our initial spawn prefab system here. When we do this get entity, not only will this game object, when converted, have the prefab components added, but also all of its children will get the prefab component added. And the meaning of having that prefab component is simply that by default, any query won't include it. And so what do we want? What if we did want to, start spinning or rendering all our prefabs? Well, normally you would think, I don't need to do that, but sometimes you might, because you might want to pre-initialize some prefab, or you might have a baker, and that baker certainly might have some dependency on a prefab, and prefab, something would either itself have to like store that reference, or you would have to like have a query that looks for that piece of data. And again, you're back to, hey, I want a reference to a prefab, and obviously I'm gonna do the simple option of just showing that spinning, but with also something that has the prefabs. I'll just do with option here. And this, by the way, is the same API pretty much for all things related to queries. So iJob entity has an attribute called with options, and query builder has with options, and entity query builder has that. And one of these flags that we can put in here is the include prefab one. And we can even say that we're specifically looking for prefabs if we so wanted. And this is a bad way to do that. I should probably put it in the with all part of it. Also, a quick reminder, because I can see things are popping up in chat. We will take all the questions at the end after. But we certainly will go through them with all prefab. There we go. Now we should see that only if it has the prefab component, this starts spinning. But at the same time, that also means that it only starts spinning once it doesn't have any leg anymore. Because that system doesn't have that attribute that query set up. Boom, boom.
Loading.
Yes. I, by the way, have burst disabled, so it doesn't take too long, but, you know.
Fair.
Let's see. Oh, interesting. It doesn't even spin anymore. I wonder why that is. What happens if I just do it without? Is that maybe because something is now storing a reference to it? I can go into detail in a bit if that is the case, because I have an idea why that might be. But let's quickly put this back to being the coin again. And I have two variations, of course, of coin. It would be this one. I can tell because it has these little dashes that it is a variant of the model. Huh.
Nope.
Well, in that case, I guess this is also a good time to show how I would debug it. Because one thing you can do is you can look at that turning spinny thing, which is this one. See, oh, right now it is a prefab, right now it isn't. Okay, so that part is working. But also, if we go into runtime view while we show it, and we then press it, we can see relationships, and therefore we can see which systems have a dependency potentially on it. And so it says, okay, it's reading from prefab and spin data. Yeah. Oh, okay. So I think what's happening here is that we are essentially spinning only the pants, because only the pants are the prefab, and so we're spinning something that isn't shown.
Fair.
That makes sense. It's a pretty bad example in that case, but I think you get the point. I think actually, if we wanted to show that point, we could probably see like a debug.log of that. Just maybe the lt.w rotation or something. Okay, my type completion is not working for me. Is there a question in the meantime I type this?
So yeah, Wayne Games had one here saying, why don't the linked entity group and the prefab tag add the prefab tag to the other entities? So I think when you showed just kind of manually adding that prefab tag, it didn't go to the child entities.
Well, we can actually look at that. Because okay, so you mentioned legs, and legs are kind of interesting. So I think it's a good to describe first what a leg is to anyone that doesn't know, because this is our first stream, so there's not really a big
And if
context.
you could just zoom back in on the code again.
Yeah. Because okay, if we do state.entity manager dot destroy entity, which is probably the best example of this, and we go to the definition, and there are obviously quite a few, but I'm just going to go to the default one. Boom, for just destroying one entity. So it obviously sets up, initial access and saying, hey, you shouldn't try to do stuff while there's a structural change going on, blah, blah. And then it is allowed to do the thing. And what is it doing? Well, it's doing destroy entity, and inside destroy entity, if we're going to destroy entities, there's this add to destroy list. And so currently the entity stores a temporary list saying, hey, these are all the things that I want to destroy. And what determines what it wants to destroy? Well, this is the destroy batch. I think it's that one at least. Boom, boom. No, it's the other part. Boom. Just going back. Add to destroy list. Wow, where is it? Oh, it's a little below. Yeah, there you go. So we then check, hey, is it empty? Have we destroyed everything yet? Otherwise, we should ideally look at that entity and see, does it have more things to add to that list? And the way it checks what it needs to add to the list is it will go ahead and find entity group array, which is here you go, linked group type. And so what it looks for is just if any entity that it is currently trying to destroy has a linked entity group on it, what more should I try to destroy? Which it does here. Boom, boom. Can it find it in the type? If so, can you please read it? If so, please add it to our list that we want to destroy. And then it goes, back to where we were, which is, here, and then down, and then it actually goes and destroys them. And this is the thing that does the destruction. So boom, here, and it repeats, and so on, which is very lovely. So as for his question, why doesn't it do that? Well, let's have a quick look. Remove component. Boom, boom. And obviously here, it's pretty simple to explain why it is. It's because adding and removing components is not going to be a leg operation. Only the creation and destruction of them are. And so, because what create entity means is it just creates a raw entity with no point of reference, that of course won't have a leg because there's not a concept of a child in that case. But as for instantiate, that one certainly has a leg group, and so it will also instantiate all of the leg parts of it. And that's actually where we want to go now. I think that it leads nicely into
Look at that.
that part. So, okay, let's have a look at instantiate and how that is implemented. Instantiate. Actually, let's go to the part of the code that actually does the instantiation, because that is, in this project. Here we go. Yes. And also one other thing to note right now, which you couldn't do in previous versions, is notice that I'm doing a state entity manager instantiate while I'm iterating. And the reason I'm allowed that is because this prefab here has a different archetype than what this would match.
Query.
Yeah, and so it knows that it would never accidentally match this prefab spawned.
Nice.
And so it wouldn't change the query's meaning. So that's why this works. And we can see that check also when we go down here. But let's see. Okay, so this is preparing for additive changes. And one reason we're doing this is this here will lock up normally any entities for each, or iJob entity run, or idiomatic for each setup that doesn't match this query. So you can see here it passes in the instantiate archetype, and here it will like do check is additive, which is the one that actually check if this additive change is possible on the archetype. You can see here for each structural change is the structure that stores what we are currently allowed to iterate over. So this is something that the idiomatic for each itself sets up beforehand, so it can do this check. And then now that it knows that we're allowed to instantiate the archetype, it will go in, instantiate during structural change. It will, obviously assert that an entity exists, blah, blah, blah. But we have an instantiate entity, instantiate entities. And the reason it goes into instantiate entities is because any instantiation of an entity could potentially be an instantiation of multiple entities. And therefore, the first thing it does check for is, does this thing have a linked group on it? And obviously, if it does, then it should instantiate that as a group instead of just as one. Right. But to simplify things, let's first check what it means to instantiate one. Obviously, more is more. So, we want to have the entity chunk, and we have a filter for it. We build some indices for the shared component if we need to copy over any shared components, because shared components, to those that don't know, are on a per chunk basis. And anytime you change a shared component, it is also a change to the archetype. And so there's a direct correlation between an archetype and its shared component, which is why you already see it here. Otherwise, it's an allocation clone, because that's what instantiate actually is. It's just, a copy. It's a direct copy, in fact. And it's a direct copy that does a few extra things other than that. Like, for instance, setting up, the shared component situation. But if we look at allocate clone, I think that's also where it does these specific extra things. I don't know, maybe Fabrice knows specifically where this is going. Boom, 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 boom. Element size. Because there is, in fact, a thing that we learned earlier is that we are instantiating, and obviously when we do the instantiation, we see that we start rendering stuff. And so that means that the prefab component obviously was deleted. And so there's something in here that makes sure that that is deleted. And actually, I could probably just search for it. So that component is called prefab. And for some funny reason, it's not in here. Maybe it's in here. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I think it is the case that any time that you have a prefab, normally it will also have a leg, even if that leg is just one. Maybe for these. Yeah, I'm not sure of that, but I would assume that's the case, because it obviously needs to go into this part in order to figure out the prefab situation. Or maybe this one, remove. Yeah, either it should do the instantiate or a copy of it, which removes cleanup components. That makes sense. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So that's what it does. It removes the prefab component, and it also instantiate any leg that is related to it. And in the opposite direction, when you have a leg, it also means that anytime you try to destroy that entity, you're gonna destroy the entire leg. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So as Fabrice points out, you can in fact just even if a prefab always has a leg attached to it when it tries to instantiate, even though you can do one. I guess his point is that if it doesn't have the leg, it will still do the correct thing. Maybe.
Maybe.
I don't know. Actually, we could check. Because this thing here is a prefab, right? When I press play and press A. Prefab, does it have a leg? Just to make sure that it doesn't, because ideally it doesn't. It doesn't? Good. So that means that if I just, have my spawner do a reference to that one, we can find out. Yes. So spawn, yeah. This one, we want to spawn the live one because we can do that. Oh my God, okay. This is going great. Oh, I think I have an iPad laying on it. Why is it? There you go. What is happening with my keyboard?
So Fabrice says, should do the right thing. The trick is instantiate archetype in the archetype struct. That's basically the whole thing minus the prefab tag and the cleanup components.
Oh, yeah, gotcha. Do you know where that particular part of the code is actually?
Do I?
No, does he?
Oh.
I guess I can actually just search if he says that's the case. Instantiate 1. Instantiate 1. No, that's. Anyways, it doesn't matter really. I think this is the time where we can go into the more advanced example. Because now we've shown off, how there's the two-part system of a prefab. There's a prefab is just a component that is added to an entity and it does exclude it from all queries, part of it. And there is a baker when it does a get entity of something that is an asset, it will add that prefab component part. And therefore that we get that this, I can reference an asset, which is my prefab, and it won't show up as an entity in the hierarchy because the reference just means that it is in the hierarchy without actually having, anything doing the rendering of it and anything actually, doing anything with it. And obviously also all the problems that can come from this, like the fact that if you have a baking system that depends on something that might now be a prefab, then it will no longer work. Like you can't have like a classic example of something that will happen is that you might initially have your spawner reference your prefab, right? And that's fine, but then you take your spawner and also make that a prefab, and well, now your spawner 2 is a prefab. So what happens then? Well, if that spawner were to have done any baking and put in this and just spawned it directly, that system would no longer have that because the system would have a context where even the spawner itself is a prefab.
Funny.
Yeah. And actually, there's an issue related to that with the last example that I will show today. And I think we're at the point where I'm going to show that one, which is the advanced baking. Because if we look here, look at this little conveyor belt that I can modify the size of.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. All modeled, by the way, in Unity with Propeller. That was fun. Well, it just has a reference to a belt. And the belt is this little model here. Because I did export the Pro Builder to an object.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's just this little model here. And then it has the length. And gonna answer Wayne's questions later.
yeah, I'm starring these here, so.
Yes. Okay, so the belt offer simply says, okay, well, the entity itself, we're not really dependent on the usage of it. But what we are dependent on is that we can, move it around and it updates accordingly. So all the like children that actually spawned conveyor belts, we do depend on those having the correct transform usage. But it doesn't come from the runtime thing. This obviously defines the runtime situation. So as a result, I'm using this depends on so that it still, updates the baker anytime that I make changes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So that's why, like, when I move it around right now, and the reason it snaps is because of this setting.
And so is that just update. One single conveyor belt, or are you like spawning like multiple little sections of that?
I am spawning multiple little sections. If we look in the runtime view, here, runtime, 1, 2, 3, 4, and if we look at the build,
there's one a little bit lower too. Yeah.
Yeah, 5. And I think I've set it to 5, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So yeah, it spawns multiples, but obviously it has to update all of those whenever I move the parent transform.
Right.
Which is
right.
Which is what you see happening. I don't want it to only update when I.
So you're doing kind of a little bit of editor baking there.
Exactly, and that's why I need the depends on.
Nice. I never knew that depends on.
It is quite lovely, and there's actually a ton of those that I can really recommend, like doing a quick writer autocomplete to see the different things that are in here, because some of them are obvious, like add buffer and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I kind of wonder what the instantiate here does.
Oh, if you instantiate something in the editor baking.
Yeah, but I don't know if this will actually work. Yeah, no, this is just an artifact of something else.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's also another one, which I have an example we will show at a later episode. Why this one is very nice to use.
Is baking because, for editor. Nice. Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of tooling you can make around that one. But anyways, as for this build, in order to spawn something in that is, safe to the scene and set up nicely, we obviously want to have a reference to the prefab and store the link, so that a baking system can see this. And we also want to specify that it is a build, and that comes in handy later. And this is all we have in here. Now, as for the component data itself, we notice some attributes above here. Temporary baking type, baking type, baking type. Okay, so what is a baking type? Well, if you look at the definition of what a baking type is, it is something that only lives during the runtime of the editor, or the baking system itself. But as soon as it is done baking, as long as the live scene here is open, as soon as I close it, it will no longer be there.
Okay.
It isn't actually saved to the scene file. That is what a baking type is. A temporary baking type is one that is only there for any modification of that. So the fact that this here author added build data also means, and that it is a temporary baking type, means that any time that you make a change to this build author or the transform, it will re-add in this build data. And so it isn't safe. Even if you keep the live scene live, it won't be there for every run. If I were to change a separate component, that component wouldn't be there. Like if I were to change something on this entity, that component wouldn't be there. And so the thing that's interesting here is normally something that is very hard to do, and something you really want to do is you want to have the ability to instantiate in a subscene. And in a subscene, you can't really do any instantiation normally because how would our serialization system know what to serialize? We actually depend on, from a baking point of view, knowing a set of GUIDs that all the entities have. So when we go to the serialization step, we expect all entities that we want to serialize to have that GUID. And maybe Fabrice can correct me on this, but that's at least what I've seen in our code. But yeah, so if we go in here, we can kind of work around it by adding our own GUID, and that's the teaser. But there is obviously an intended way, and this is the way that we recommend in most cases. If you can fit your program into this, that is what we want you to use, which is the create additional entity. And what you can see here is it wants to know whether it's a transform usage, like the transform usage flag of that entity that you're spawning. It wants to know, are you only going to use this entity during baking? And obviously a name for it would be nice. The problem in this example that I have here is that I want them all to have nice meshes and like some rendering happening.
Sure.
And I could do that myself. And we actually have samples of that. I recommend checking the entity samples because Brian recently added, I don't think it's that recently, but it's not more than like a year old at the very least, a sample on how you were to put in render meshes. Yeah, exactly. Those GUIDs are important for live baking. So anyways, yeah, exactly, those samples. But if we like look here, it means if we use create additional entity, we have to add everything ourselves, and we have utility for that, and that is what those samples will show. But that is also a limitation. It means that you have to do more stuff for if there's multiple meshes, if there are specific components that you want added to it. Yeah. But the nice thing here is that it will set up all the correct GUI GUID situation and lex, because you want like this entity to, if it becomes a parent, to have the correct parenting set up, and yeah.
Nice.
So that's why you normally would use that one, because there's a lot of limitations with the approach that I'm going to show now.
Okay.
But it does work with live baking somewhat. And Fabrice, please do point out any issues, because I do have one. And it's actually also kind of the point of the show. While I do work there, I obviously don't have the knowledge of every single feature of the.
You didn't write the whole ECS code base?
No, not quite. And there's definitely also a lot of legacy in there. So yeah, no, there's bound to be some stuff that I don't fully understand and some incorrections here.
This is quite a big system, actually.
It is, because live baking is all about having an entity that you only incrementally update, so you don't do the whole thing every time, and you also are not supposed to like. You want it to be that when I make any changes in here, you can see 4 entities are spawned. Mm-hmm. Obviously, when I do a change to this one component, I want it to then be 5.
Right.
One thing one could do is every single time baking is run, it just deletes all 4 and then recreates them.
Sure. Yeah.
But obviously, in a larger system, that's going to be a big slowdown.
Right. Yeah. So you would only want to add new things instead of whacking everything out, and then
Exactly. And so you want to be able to bake those live and keep only the ones that you're changing. And that's why that temporary component is so important, because while the baking component will be there for the entire time that you have your scene open, the temporary component will always only be there for the one time that you did a modification to this offer, right? To anything that the initial baker here set up, because it is the one that adds the build data. So that's the only time that build data is going to be alive. it is normally just going to delete it at the end of every baking run. Which also means that if you have something like this, where I'm going to add the build still here tag to everything that has a build data, so everything that is currently edited in this frame and still doesn't have this component. And so therefore we expect this to only get added to the few entities that are, being modified. And so we could also have done, before this, we could have had a little for each go over and set up some initial state that we wanted to only, have run there once. I don't need it for this example, but that's why you would do it. And then you go down here, and we destroy the previous linked entity group. And now also notice how I'm saying fake. And that's because, and that's one of the other limitations of this, because we're so, intertwined with how leg is set up during this GUI and live baking setup. And we have all these like extra, if you look here, additional entities, baking data, and stuff like that. And I think there's even a linked entity group version of it, if I recall. So we have some specific ones that we depend on in baking specifically, which means that you can't use the official components, so you kind of have to create your own fake ones, and that's what I've done here. So linked entity group fake is just a buffer, and it's actually a cleanup buffer.
Okay. Nice.
So yeah, and that's why we have to do this thing where we say, okay, well, I have this query, and I'm gonna get an entity array of it. And so, because I have a dependency on build data, this code inside of here will only get run for all the entities that have you just modified. This current modification, only those things will be run on here. And so the first time around, it won't have the linked entity group fake, and so we add it. And that's allowed because we are doing, we are creating an entity array, and so we're looping over an already created array of entities. We're not actively looping over while querying. So therefore, we can do the adding of the buffer. But also, this system, because it's run every single baking loop, it might run into cases where it has already seen that linked buffer, and that means that it should, destroy the previous iteration of the previous conveyor belts. So this is what actually destroys all 4 of those when I turn it into 5. And this buffer is just a list of all the entities connected to that particular belt.
Right.
And then we clear the buffer so as to set it to 0. So we don't try to delete something that has already been deleted. But yeah, this loop down here is exactly the same loop as this one, except obviously this one has been turned into an entity array, and I don't want that to normally be the case. I want to be able to iterate over archetypes. Okay. So therefore, I'm doing this here. So it's still dependent on build data, and so it only runs on the particular builds that I changed. But it also is dependent on the entity GUID of the initial entity. And it's also dependent on the linked entity fake group, even if that is 0, because obviously we want to add anything that we added. And this thing called the transform offering, which is a nice little component that is valid during baking that tells you about like what was the original parent, if any, what was the original transform information that you would have gotten from your Unity engine transform from your original game object of that entity. So that's a nice handy construct. Yeah, okay. And obviously we also want to make sure that it is a build still here, because that means that we've currently initialized it. So if we go down here, we have this imbuilt entities, and I'm going to resize it to the amount of builds, which also means that I can do a bulk instantiation. I can instantiate all my conveyor belts in bulk here. And you can do this handy little operation where, I have already stored a native list that is persistently allocated here. And then I'm just going to constantly resize it, which means that it's going to be free every time that it resizes to the same length or below, or even a slight amount above, depending on the state it's currently in.
Gotcha.
So I don't have to reallocate every single frame, every single for each. Yeah, and the nice thing too is, okay, now I've instantiated all of them and that array gets filled, and I'm allowed to use uninitialized memory because I know this thing is going to fill them. Then I add all of these build entities to my fake linked entity group. That's why they're called LEG. Linked entity group.
I get, okay.
Yeah. It's not an actual LEG. Yeah, and then for every single build, I will say, hey, I want to look at your linked entity group because you might actually have additional, you might also be a linked entity group because you had multiple meshes or something set up. And then I loop over every single one of those, make sure that they have a unique GUI ID set up. And that's what I was talking about earlier. About like to properly serialize to disk and also for live baking to know what changes what. You have to set up an ID every time that is, consistent. Okay, I can see Luke commented on that. That's kind of funny. But yeah, so you have to set up an ID that you know to be unique, and ideally that ID is the same across runs, which it will be in this case because when I'm spawning builds, I'm doing it in a forward action, which makes sense because it's just going to be I plus 1, I plus 2, etc. And so the first build, the one at the first location will always have the same ID in this scenario. I'm just adding the ID. And so, okay, now I've set up a proper entity GUID, which means I'm going to serialize this build correctly to disk. I then also have to make sure that if the parent, and this is one of the quirks of instantiation as well. So if we look at this code, it says, okay, if we have a parent component, like if any of our, this is my main object, my main build, and my build has all these submeshes on it. If one of those has a parent that is equal to the original spawn prefab, then that's a problem, and we should update it to the spawned version of it. Because what happens is when you spawn an object, it might not remap all the parents over because those are just a component, and it will, that component on the below entities will still have a parent set as the original parent, and that original parent would be a prefab. And so therefore the parent they would be pointing to is the one where they're not going to be shown or do anything practical. And so you want to ideally update this if that's the case, and that's what we're doing here. We are making sure that the parent is the one that we are actually instantiating. Yeah, so that's another quirk of instantiation, is that you have to remember that if you're trying to instantiate a set of children, they might not have the parent updated, but it is fairly easy to do an operation like this. Yeah, and obviously we also want to make sure that all of its children too are added to the fake linked entity group, so that when we go to destroy it, we're also destroying the builds entities.
Sure. Yeah.
And that the build too has its own unique entity GUID, which we're doing here. And that's why I'm just using an incrementing number, because ideally that should, set up things correctly. There is one point which is never mind. Don't think about it. Okay, so
Forget it.
Yes, and so obviously the builds are just 1 meter long, and so it's very easy for me to
You
just
just
do
increment the X position, yeah.
Exactly. So the first one starts at 0, and then 1, and etc. And they are placed along the x-axis. And then I set the local to world because they are going to have a local to world, just due to the fact that they are a prefab, which is another quirk. So you know how we have transform usage flags, and this is going on a bit of a tangent. But you know how we have transform usage flags? Well, they work a little different when it comes to prefabs because say I had, this one is just set to dynamic, and obviously it's just going to be for the object itself. This one is not a prefab situation. Well, that means that it's going to both have a local transform and it's going to have a local to world. And if I had renderable here, it would only have the local to world.
Right.
Now, the thing is, if this then were to be a prefab, it would actually get changed to a local transform, like a dynamic here. And you can actually, if you go to transform usage flag, you can see this quirk that prefab. Is this really the only place? Okay, what does the sentence say? If the helicopter can shoot some bullets, the bullet entity prefab should be marked as dynamic to be instantiated to the right position. I think there's another place that should. I know it is especially true for the world space. World space is definitely not going to work. But yeah, there's definitely, it doesn't seem there's a documentation around it, which, okay, that should be fixed. But there is a problem when you try to instantiate a prefab whereby it won't abide by transform usage flags like world, force world, something, world space, I think. Yeah, the world space option here. Yeah. And there's an argument behind it that I can't remember right now, which is also why it is just something to be aware of. So anyways, we need to both set the local to world and local transform. Technically, I could just set the local transform and it would update, but you would get a frame delay. So it's better to just change both of them. And the calculation isn't that difficult.
Right.
So that's what I'm doing here. I'm doing the translation according to what I expect, and also I'm going to multiply with the actual local to world, which also means that rotation ideally should work somewhat, because I'm not doing it here for whatever reason. Actually, I don't know why I'm not doing that. I should probably do a transform, which is such a good
transform.
It is such. It is a name and a half. Actually, I think it's transform. It's another version of it that is taking in a matrix. I guess not. I can transform it by rotation, because that means I can do tr dot value arrow dot rotation, and so now it should abide by that. And in case you forgot, tr is our transform offering, and so this is our construct whereby we can see all the master built entity, the one that does all of this offering, transform. So if it were a child itself and had a different position, etc., it would still contain the information from the upper one. And yeah, I just use that, and this should work. And I think it might. Oh, is it rotate instead?
Well, just real quick, just to explain what you're doing here, where you're setting both the local to world and the local transform. Like the local transform, that's kind of the easy to edit component that we typically are going to be updating when we're like moving things around within the world. But then the local to world is what the rendering API actually uses to know where to render that object on the screen. And then there's basically kind of a system that happens in the middle of the frame that takes everything in that local to, or the local transform, and then converts it into the local to world matrix. So, if we don't, if we're setting, say, just the local transform, but we set that after the transform update group already ran, then that local to world is not going to be updated with the current position that we set. So there ends up being like a 1 frame delay where it, say, just renders it at 000 for 1 frame, and then the next frame it will be in the correct position. So if you just set them both, then you can basically just avoid that, because that's all that transform system really does, is it just kind of updates that local to world with whatever you have set on the local transform.
Exactly. And by the way, the system he was talking about is the one called, let's see, update after, and I'm typing too much, type of transform system group. Yep. And this is the group that contains all the systems related to turning your local transform into a local to world, which is then rendered. It's also a good point to say that, like, any time that you want to do any transform related work, like spawning a bullet, it is important to know which data to set in order to instantiate that bullet, because it might be that you spawn the bullet after the transform system has already run. And so even though you set the local transform on that bullet, it still wouldn't work, because that bullet would have an updated local transform, but the transform system hadn't run, and so the local to world wouldn't have run,
right?
Be updated, and therefore the bullet just stays in the middle of the scene and looks very odd for 1 frame. Yeah. So sometimes it can be good to order your systems after where the transform system group lies. And also, kind of back to this, there's another part of this to make live baking work, which is that, and I haven't figured out this fully myself yet either, but if we look in here, and hopefully I didn't break anything in the meantime. Man, that's taking a while. Barely did any changes. Just I commenting on the way that I say bullet.
Bullet.
Bullet. I feel bullied.
This guy.
Okay, it seems things are still working. Okay, so if we look here, and I go over here, notice how the belt still is in the correct position. Yeah. If I remove this code here, something very quirky is going to happen, and that kind of goes into what I said previously. This is a very powerful setup, but it is also one with many quirks that you have to be aware of.
It seems like there are a lot of different things that you have to account for to make sure that everything works, as you want it to.
Yeah, and I guess a question then comes up of, like, why would you want to do it this way? And the simple reason is for any scenario where performance matters. Like when you hit play, you want the scene to be ready, and you don't want to have all this initial setup. Because the thing that is very easy to do here is you would just have a spawn system at runtime that spawns in the builds. And if you want something nice rendering, so you can like pre-visualize it before runtime, you would have that system that does the spawning of those builds. You would put on it a world system filter of, and I can show what those are. On top of here, you would put in a world system filter called editor. And that means that the system will also run in the editor, and so it would spawn them in the editor and thus get the visualization of them being in the editor. But as soon as you hit play, it won't be the editor system running anymore. It would have deleted the editor world and spawned in the default world, and then run the default version also, which also spawns them. So you would always see the build, which is kind of nice for pre-visualization.
Cool. Yeah.
And I do that quite often. But it does mean that, when you go to build the game and you open up that game, now what was saved in the scene was in fact not a version of the file that had all of the entities pre-spawned, but a version of the file where there was one entity probably. And it had some data on how it should spawn it, and it would deserialize that, and then a system would run and actually put in all the belts or whatever you have spawning. And so it would be a runtime problem instead of being one at big time. And so that's why you want to do this. But obviously, where it matters is in bigger cases than what I'm showing for this belt. For this case here that I'm showing off, I actually wouldn't have done it this way. I would have just done a normal editor system that also runs as a default system that spawns both of them, so that you have the previous and you can much easier debug it, because you don't need this whole ceremony. You just need something similar to what we did with.
You just kind of want to show though what's possible with some of the baking systems. Yeah, the custom baking system stuff is super interesting.
Exactly.
I've used it a little bit, but
yeah, you kind of want something as simple as this actually, ideally. And this is obviously also where what I was talking about earlier could have worked. Actually, let's kind of try that, because I think if I just remove this, it would just every frame spawn a new entity.
World system filter.
Why do I have two of these? Aren't they copies? These are two are the same. I don't know why I have two of them. Anyways,
you could spawn two every frame instead of one.
Yeah, that's gonna ouch machine. So yeah, I can say default, and I can say which makes them run in the player, and I can say editor. If I can get any type completion, that would be nice. There we go. And what we should see happening now is we should see these see a coin spawn. Actually, technically a bunch of coins. They're not going to move, but they're
going to be at the same position, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, they would show up in the editor, as opposed to only when I hit play. Yeah, so you can see they are in the editor, and what we probably also will see, if I go into the runtime view, is we will see. Actually, I'm surprised. Oh yeah,
it's only when you move around, you see that it spawns a new one. Yeah.
Yeah, because it doesn't run the update loop of that every frame. Only some frames. Only the ones where I click
something.
Yeah. Or updated it. Similar to how the shader only updates when I move it around.
Right.
But yeah, it is very nice being able to see that coin before I go in and hit play. So now when I go and hit play, I can see.
Now that's yeah.
Yeah. Yes. But going back to the problem that I had earlier, and now I'm just going to quickly remove that. Boom, boom. Also, in the meantime that this is compiling, I can answer, shouldn't we just avoid spawning things after the transform system? And while that is a lovely goal, that is not always something you can do. Maybe you have a system that only spawns something based on the world position of something else. And so in order to figure out the world position for that criteria, like spawning when you're near something, spawn a particle system or something, you would have to know the world, have an updated version of the local to world of the player. And so you would run that system after the transform system. And then you might want an entity command buffer system to then, you instantiate in an entity command buffer, you do the instantiation during, that time after a transform system, but then you make sure that you only do the actual instantiation before the transform system of the next frame.
Right. And one of the tricks that I usually take is just use one of the built-in entity command buffer systems, but usually the begin simulation entity command buffer system, which is most likely, depending on when you're running it, it's going to run on the next frame. Basically, it queues those operations up for the next frame.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so here we can see the quirk I was talking about when I don't do that transform thing. So here it updates nicely, But as soon as I go and press, actually I'm gonna quickly change the build length. As soon as I go and press something like this, notice how I can't see it anymore, and that's because all builds are spawned at this location. And the reason for that is that when live baking goes and save stuff, again, this is one of those weird quirks of live baking that you have to be aware of, is that on the separate runs, they will all contain this transform offering as their basis instead of the actual transform components. So just because I saved inside my baking system here, just because I saved the proper local to world and local transform doesn't actually mean they get saved for any, subsequent runs of baking. And instead, what they have saved it to is this transform offering. Which also means that if I just check if it has this transform offering component, and then do a actually I don't need to do this because that's just equal to the tr dot value. I don't know. Anyways, so I just make sure that they have the correct position up front, and then I have to fill out manually all the build transform offering for every single build, making sure that they are the same as the actual build entity. But yeah, once I've done that, I play back in the ECB. But what you might notice also is all of these commands in here are set component, set component, set component, has component. Sure, which also means that for the most part, I haven't actually used anything ECB related. So where am I using the ECB, you might ask? Actually, I asked that too. I don't think I am actually doing that anymore. Yeah, okay. So initially I did use it for parent, but I couldn't figure out any setup where I could actually get a parent relationship to work. So that's another part of this, is that, again, because additive changes like instantiate, create entity, and create archetype all work while iterating, as long as that
it doesn't match that query. Yeah,
exactly. It means that I can do all changes with
a normal, as long as you're not adding more things to what you're iterating against.
Exactly. And it's way faster than actually trying to use an entity command buffer and then playing it back, because it is painfully slow compared to an entity manager. So yeah, I'm not even using the ECB, which is great. It means that all these changes will be happening directly as they're modified. And now that we've made all these changes, and these changes only happen to the builds that is currently being edited, or the set of builds that are currently being edited, I could technically have multiple builds all doing this, and it works totally fine. Like when you select two entities and you two game objects and you change the length of both of them to the same number, that would work, because then they will both get the build data tag on it.
Sure. Yeah.
So that works nicely. And then the final bit is, okay, what happens then if, say, I were to remove the component or I delete the entity? Then I also want in my live stream that all of the entities then become, all the builds are removed. And so I do a similar thing that I did above with the linked entity fake group. I do, if you have build still here tag, but you don't have a build spawner tag, it means that you actually went and deleted that entity. And so now this will act upon every single entity that has been deleted. And the reason for it is that this is a baking type that is an iCleanup component data. And so the iCleanup component data, as we know, is gonna stick around even if that entity were to be destroyed, until it itself also is removed, and then the entity dies. And this one is just a normal component, and so this one sticks around, and you try to destroy the entity, so therefore this component is no longer there, while this one is, because it's a cleanup. that means that entity is trying to be cleaned up, but hasn't yet. And so I go and do that. And then notice another thing. I do all the changes that I want that use the fact of the linked entity group in here, but the actual cleaning and removing of the component I do later with a query, because it means I can do it on an entire archetype. So there is another nice, bulk change.
Nice.
And that is actually all the systems and quirks I wanted to show today.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that. We went really in depth into a lot of the stuff and like some of the actual like ECS code and what's kind of like going on really under the hood. And I think we got a good look at a bunch of different things, especially those baking systems, because those are definitely good to use. So anyways, yeah, now we're kind of at the Q&A section of the show, which I call the buffer, because we have some questions buffered up here. Have you guys been liking these funny little names that I've been putting up on the little sections? I think they're fun. But anyways, we do have a bunch of questions here that we can kind of go through. So we already hit a couple of these. So could I create an aspect instead of creating the long for eaches? So yeah, you definitely can create aspects. The one thing that I was curious about, and you probably can't do this directly on the aspect, but I know when you did like you're modifying the query to have like the with options to like do some of the different query options. You can't do that like directly on the aspect, right? You just probably add that to your query.
Yeah. You can do also entity query builder with aspect and yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah. No, aspects are definitely handy if you have a whole lot of components, and especially if you're using those same components, that same set of components in multiple places. So actually, I do use a couple of aspects in my netcode for entities tutorial for some of the combat stuff, just because there are a couple for each loops that we have to use those things in. So if I have the same prefab in two different subscenes, will baking process generate two entities for each of the subscenes? I did see Fabrice did address this question, saying yes, prefabs are embedded in subscenes at the moment, they aren't shared. So
yes,
thank you very much, Fabrice. Is it possible to instantiate the entity prefab from another world? Question from entities 0.51 user. Again, Fabrice to the rescue. No instantiation across worlds. So thank you very much.
Just to add to that also, it kind of makes sense too when you think about like what the meaning of an entity currently is. That there's always going to be a world attached to an entity, and so just by passing in an entity doesn't mean that it would know the world necessarily.
Right. So you can't...
Also, actually, there is one method that you can use, which is called like move chunks or something across worlds.
Oh yeah. You can like move something from one world to another. Yeah. So let's see. So you can't make a prefab that reference a prefab in one of its base components.
Yeah, make a prefab.
Do you know if you're able to do that or not?
Oh, you totally can. Like it is a tree, right? So like if one prefab requires another prefab and that requires another prefab, then it's going to do those in reverse order. It's going to bake the lowest one first and then go up from there.
Interesting. Nice. Very important question from Aya. My friend wants to know if we should leave DOS to smart people or if it's worth learning if you're dumb.
Well, I like that question, but I also think it's not necessarily easy to answer. It kind of depends on like what kind of game you're making, because some games lend themselves very well to being able to query everything and very easily get
totally
all the entities. Like an RTS style game, it would be nice to just say, hey, when I'm selecting all these things that have this criteria, then please give it, or like a factory style game, saying, hey, move all these things. That's very nice, and So you don't necessarily need to be smart, and sometimes it's also easier to do things these ways.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it is definitely a bigger learning curve, especially now. So it also depends on how much time you have on your hand. Like
Right.
kind of
Yeah. No,
give them
and
the
we
basic
definitely
grasp.
went pretty in depth during the kind of main showcase section here about, going into some like the real deep stuff into the Unity ECS API. And you don't necessarily need to do that if you're working on a DOS project, especially if you're just experimenting around with it and having fun. Again, there's some nice features in there like System API, which we've talked about, which kind of automate a lot of the stuff for you, so you don't have to end up writing a ton of code and worry about all crazy dependencies and stuff. So what is the main issue of using a baking system in a nutshell? Because as long as I understand, the game in runtime will work anyway, testing/creating the game.
The main use is okay. So definitely the easiest one is the cases where you're just setting values. So for instance, making sure that you have already done create additional entity and you set up all your rocks and they're just placed correctly to begin with. Then it's just a baking system. The only thing it will do is loop over and set the positions. It will only do setting. It won't do any adding, which I'm doing here, or any of that. So that's like the simple case. And what you use that for is like you would use it for all the grass in your game to have like a simple offering workflow for your grass, or you could use it for like setting up a little spaceship or stuff like that. There are some particular cases. Obviously, in a case of graphics is the one that does that. We take every entity in our whole baking scene and we turn that into one thing called the render mesh array. That's just the combined thing of all of them. So that's another use for a baking system, and that is done with a baking system. But obviously, as you say yourself, runtime will work no matter if you're doing that stuff at runtime or at baking time. It's just some of the stuff that you might want to initially set up at runtime, you might be able to pull into a baking time setup, and then therefore, because it's in a baking, it will be built into your game when you go and build the game.
Makes sense. I do see Fabrice clarifies you can move stuff across worlds after instantiation, but you cannot do both at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Nice. Aya, your friend is very much welcome. Cool. And I should point out, by the way, I think, Danny, you did post the link to the GitHub. I'll go ahead and pin that message in the chat right now, and I'll put it in like the pinned comment to this video. But we have the GitHub repository for all the code that was showcased today. So that's available to anyone and everyone to go into. If you want to kind of refresh on things a little bit, feel free to do so. And it's got the whole project file, so you can download the project and play around with it yourself there. So with that, I think we can kind of move into, what is this, like the final kind of main section here. So actually I did see one quick comment come in here. So assume that any system that implements iSystem use default world system, and we don't have to add that attribute. Am I right? Yeah.
That is indeed, no, that's indeed correct. The only case where that might not be true is if you have a custom bootstrap setup.
Right. And yeah, those world system flags are super nice and handy to use. I use those quite a bit in the netcode for entities stuff, so you can determine if something's running on the client worlds and server worlds and all that. So yeah,
and I think we even set it up so any number above 64 can be used as like a custom filter for when you do have that custom bootstrap.
And then, did you have any thoughts on this? So it looks like Dreaming I'm Latios once said baking systems are really difficult to use correctly and few people get it right. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that? Because it definitely seemed like with that baking system, again, it was quite extensive. And I had only messed around with them like probably like a year ago, one time, and yeah, I mean, I had to kind of play around with things a little bit more than some of the other stuff. But yeah, did you have any kind of thoughts on the difficulty of it?
I mean, I definitely agree, and what's especially hard, and we also don't really have any APIs to help you, and we might in the future. I don't know. Also, this is obviously me talking and not a promise. But the problem comes with live conversion. Anything live related is very hard. This is what we kind of talked about today, the incremental updating and so on, which is also why setting values is so much easier, because we don't really have anything of like an initial setup and some removal, because you're not creating and destroying stuff. You're just setting it. So that part doesn't even need to be incremental. So that part is a lot easier. And so I don't, you know, if you have a case that perfectly fits that, it's easy to use a baking system. Any time else, it's really hard, and I probably wouldn't do it unless absolutely necessary. Unless you're someone like, I don't know, Stunlock, which I think does a lot of it. I know they really like baking.
Nice. Cool. Good to know. Real quick, in addition to the creating aspects question, does it have any performance consequences? My initial thought on this is no, just because aspects basically use code generation and it all gets compiled down to the same stuff anyways, right?
I'm going to read the comment correctly.
Like as far as creating aspects for some long for eaches.
I mean, it kind of one of the main problems that are with aspects is the fact that it makes it really hard to work with batchable stuff. Like a lot of the code I showed off earlier certainly wouldn't be possible in an aspect, just because an aspect is a per entity, like a slice of an entity situation. So like the long for eaches you would still kind of need for that. What you wouldn't need the long for each for is like, I don't know, with the main loop you can still turn it over, but that's just going to move the problem. And there's the fact that you can't use system API in an aspect.
Right. And yeah, we definitely got pretty in depth on some things here today. I do just still want to make this, of course, anyone is welcome here. And we do want to just kind of, continually talk about some of these concepts. And even if you don't understand everything right away, hopefully you'll pick the little things up here and there over time and can actually see why some of these things, are beneficial, and just kind of encourage you to start playing around with them a little bit more yourselves. Of course, check out some of the videos on my channel if you want more kind of like walkthrough tutorials, and even Code Monkey's recent tutorials, just like a super good introduction into getting your hands wet with dots and everything. So yeah, I think we can go ahead and move into the last section of the show, which is the dynamic allocation. So this is just kind of like our fun little wrap up where we just, each of the hosts will bring something to the table that we can basically share with the community. And yeah, this just can be kind of like a fun video or a game or even like an article that we came across, something maybe it's related to data-oriented design, or it's just something, totally cool and fun and off the wall. So yeah, anyways, Danny, what is your dynamic allocation of the week?
Yeah, mine is a little video by a guy called Kelley, who has his own language called SIG. It's gotten quite big at this point. It's a C-like language, and it's beginning to grow. But this video that I want to show you guys is he did a nice little talk about how he updated their compiler to use more data-oriented principles. And so this is a very beginner-friendly one, at least if you've seen Mike Acton's very famous data-oriented design talk from CPP conference 2014. This almost works like a second version of that. So he goes into some basic concepts of how to understand alignment, what it actually means, and then kind of builds on top of that, and then goes into his compiler. I think it is a really good way to get into data-oriented design, and yeah, that's why I want to show it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I watched about like half of this video last night, and I thought it was, again, a really good introduction into a lot of data-oriented design concepts, and showing kind of some practical ways that it's implemented. And I think this really gives you a good kind of like peek under the hood of what Unity ECS is kind of doing for you. So I think the more you kind of understand these fundamental concepts, the more you can really take advantage of, using dots and everything like that.
Yeah, and it was actually part of a conference called Handmade Cities, which I can definitely also recommend. It's
it's
a bunch
part of the whole
data-oriented.
Casey Meritori's, I think he kind of kicked off the whole handmade thing with his, was it the Handmade Hero streams that he did? And then, now there's kind of a whole organization that has kind of grown, and I don't think Casey's even a part of it anymore. But yeah, it is a really cool movement, and a lot of the people in there kind of use kind of more performance aware and data oriented design principles in a lot of the things that they're making. So yeah, good stuff. Yeah. So then my dynamic allocation of the week is this game called Red Snow. So there was, Video Game Donkey, who I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with. He has a publishing studio called Big Mode Publishing, Big Mode Studios, something like that, Big Mode. And so they actually put on a game jam recently within the past month or so. And this was the winner of it. I actually came across this game when I saw, I think like itch.io had posted a video playthrough of it. It is just this like hilarious arcadey snowboarding game where you're just like murdering all these guys on the ski slopes here. It's totally hilarious, like very reminiscent of like the, like late 90s, early 2000s type games where you have like the announcer is saying all kinds of funny and ridiculous things. One of my favorite lines from it is, "Late stage capitalism? How about late stage your life?" And so it just has all these like ridiculous, funny things. It's a fun game to play. And they did end up winning the Big Mode Game Jam. And so on here, they have a development log, just kind of like talking about the whole development process, about how they made the game and everything. So super cool. I would highly recommend people go ahead and check that out. And I'll go ahead and post a link here. So you don't play as the penguin, you play as this American hero right here, and as you can see, you're killing these like G.I. Joe Cobra looking dudes.
Johnny, where's the blood warning here? There's a lot of blood on screen.
Right. I mean, the game is called Red Snow, so
it's ketchup, all of it.
Exactly. Yeah, ketchup. So yeah, it's a really fun game. I would recommend checking it out. I did have like the number 3 high score on it for a little bit, and I checked last night, and I'm still number 10. So. Anyways, I think that is basically all we got for the show. I think the last thing that we'll go ahead and do is just send a very much thank you to our Patreon supporters. This is super cool that many of you have already gone ahead and supported us over there on Patreon. So just take a quick moment to thank the people at the CPU register tier, which is our highest support tier. So we do have a supporter on there, eCool. Thank you very much for your support. We really appreciate it. Once again, go ahead and check out patreon.com/turbomakesgames. We have a lot of cool perks and bonuses there. Like you can get this show in an audio podcast format. So I'll have that up probably within the hour after the show here. We also have access to our internal show notes where you can read through everything that we talked over today. And at some of the other tiers, you can get like some behind the scenes content, other Q&A type stuff. So a lot of fun stuff going on over there. So would highly recommend it. So anyways, that is it for our first episode of the Hot Path Show. Danny, thank you so much for joining me here today and kind of sending me this idea to kick off the whole thing. You're kind of like the missing piece of that kind of this live show that I had in mind. So really appreciate that. Hope you enjoyed the first episode. And you got any closing comments here?
Not at all. This is great. I mean, this is so fun to do, and also just share some of the more hard parts and the things you don't really find in documentation. This has been good.
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Sounds like people very much enjoyed it, and I know we all had a ton of fun here too. So, Anyways, hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and we'll see you next week. It's going to be me and Tobias on here. Don't know what the topic is going to be yet, but we're going to be having a good stream for you again. So anyways, take care, everybody. Have a fantastic weekend. We'll see you then.
Bye.